A Navy SEAL was denied his own K9 at the shelter, until the dog broke down the door to reach him. The kennel door was steel and latched from the outside, and it held every dog that had ever been behind it, without exception. Until Thursday morning, when a 5-year-old German Shepherd named Ranger decided that 8 months of patience was long enough and put his full 79 pounds into the latch mechanism 3 times until something gave. The shelter director heard it from his office. He heard the crack of the latch, and then the sound of paws on concrete, and then the particular silence that a building falls into when something unexpected has just happened inside it. He opened his office door and found the dog sitting in the middle of the hallway, facing the exit. Ranger did not look at him. Ranger was looking at the door through which, 40 seconds earlier, a man in a worn canvas jacket had been walked out and told he would not be approved for adoption. The door had already closed. Ranger sat and waited for it to open again. Before we continue, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. If this story moves you, please subscribe and stay until the very end. We read every single one. What you're about to hear is the story of a dog who understood something about loyalty that a man in an office had never learned. Senior Chief Petty Officer Nathan Cole, retired, was 41 years old and carried himself the way men carry themselves when they have been places that rearranged their understanding of what ordinary life was supposed to feel like. He was 6 feet and 2 inches tall and 195 pounds of frame that had been built for purpose and then left to find a new one. With dark hair kept short by habit and a jaw that suggested opinions he was selective about expressing. His right shoulder had been reconstructed twice. A Ramadi rooftop in 2017 had introduced him to a piece of copper-jacketed metal that the surgeon in Germany had described, with clinical admiration, as having missed 3 things it absolutely should not have missed, and it still caught on cold mornings with a specific complaint that he had learned to factor into his movement, the way a pilot factors in a crosswind. His eyes were a deep, clear brown that people sometimes called warm, which was accurate in the limited sense that warm and still are not mutually exclusive. He had a way of listening that made people feel attended to and slightly examined at the same time, and he had developed this quality over 19 years of operating in environments where the difference between those 2 things was the difference between a good debrief and a disastrous one. He had done 4 deployments with Naval Special Warfare Command, Kandahar in 2010, Ramadi twice, and a 4th rotation in eastern Syria that had lasted 14 months, and that he described, when asked, as uneventful, which was not the kind of uneventful anyone had believed. He had come home from Syria to a right shoulder that required a second surgery and a medical retirement that he'd been prepared for and still hadn't been. He'd moved to Corbin, Kentucky 9 months ago because a man he'd served with had a property there with a tenant house available, and because Corbin was 4 hours from where he'd grown up and far enough from where he'd been that the distance felt like something he could use. The mountains outside his window were the Appalachians, old and worn and permanent, and some mornings they were the only thing he looked at when he got his coffee. He had not expected Ranger. He had gone to the Whitley County Animal Shelter in early October because he'd read that the shelter had retired military working dogs, and because the VA counselor he'd been seeing every 2 weeks had told him, in her indirect way, that a dog was not the worst idea. He had gone with no expectations and had looked through the kennel windows without speaking to anyone, and Ranger had been at the back of his kennel, turned away, not performing the anxious energy of the other dogs. When Nathan stopped at his kennel, Ranger turned around. He crossed to the door and sat down, and he looked at Nathan with dark amber eyes that held the steady, patient quality of an animal that had been through enough to know the difference between noise and meaning, and had decided this was meaning. They had looked at each other through the wire mesh for 4 minutes, without either of them moving. Nathan had left and come back the next day, and the day after that. Ranger was 5 years old, 79 pounds, with a coat that ran from deep black along his spine and ears to a rich tan at his chest and paws, the particular coloring that German Shepherds carry like a uniform. He had a scar that ran from his right shoulder to the top of his front leg, a clean line from a training accident in 2020 when a cable had snapped during an obstacle course and clipped him before the trainers could react. He had been retired from service after the injury was fully assessed, not because the injury had broken him, but because the program's protocols required it. He had been at the shelter for 8 months. In 8 months, he had not connected with anyone. He had been evaluated twice for aggressive tendencies because he would not engage with the standard socialization activities, and both evaluations had concluded the same thing. The dog was not aggressive. The dog was waiting. For what, nobody at the shelter had been able to determine. Until Nathan Cole stopped at his kennel on a Tuesday in October and didn't say anything, and Ranger sat down and looked at him. The Whitley County Animal Shelter smelled of pine disinfectant and the kind of damp that comes from concrete floors that can never entirely dry. The fluorescent lights ran at a flat, forgiving glow that turned every face the same color and made the kennel runs look longer than they were. The sounds were the specific sounds of a building that held living things that were waiting. The occasional bark, the movement of a dog shifting in its kennel, the hum of climate control that was always either too warm or not warm enough. In the mornings, before the public arrived, it was almost quiet. And in that almost quiet, you could hear the individual breathing of the animals if you stood still long enough. Parker Raines had been the director of the Whitley County Animal Shelter for 9 years. He was 53 years old and wore his authority with the particular combination of pride and defensiveness that develops in people who have been the most important person in a small institution for long enough to mistake the institution for themselves. He was not a cruel man in any obvious way. He fed the animals, maintained the facility, submitted his reports on time, and attended every county board meeting prepared to defend his budget with the specific competence of someone who understood how to protect what he controlled. He was the kind of official who believed that rules were not tools of administration but expressions of order itself, and that exceptions to rules were not flexibility but failure. He had interpreted the county's adoption policies with the consistency of someone who had decided that interpretation was the same as intention, and in 9 years he had never been seriously challenged on any of it. He had denied Nathan Cole's adoption application on Thursday morning. The reason was the lease. Nathan's rental agreement with his property owner, a standard form lease for a rural tenant property, contained a clause restricting large dogs. Parker Raines had reviewed the lease, noted the clause, and denied the application. He had presented this to Nathan at the service window with the practiced efficiency of someone closing a file. "The policy requires a copy of any lease agreement," Raines said. "Your lease restricts dogs over 35 pounds. Ranger is 79 pounds. The application cannot be processed." Nathan had looked at him for a moment. "I can get a written waiver from the property owner," he said. "I already spoke to him. He said it's not an issue. The waiver would need to be notarized and submitted with a new application," Raines said. "Processing takes 5 to 7 business days. At that point, Ranger will be available through the standard adoption queue again. He's a retired military working dog," Nathan said. "The federal MNWD adoption program, we are a county facility," Raines said. "We follow county policy." He closed the folder. "You're welcome to reapply." There were 4 other people in the lobby. None of them said anything. One of them, a woman in her 70s with white hair and the particular stillness of someone who has seen something like this before and has been waiting for it to happen again, pressed her hands flat against the counter and did not move them. Nathan turned and walked to the exit. He did not look back. He opened the door and went out into the October cold. 40 seconds later, Ranger broke the latch on his kennel door. That woman at the counter was Agnes Dalton, 74 years old, who had been volunteering at the Whitley County shelter every Tuesday and Thursday for 11 years. She had cleaned kennels and walked dogs and filled water bowls and held animals during their final hours with the steady, matter-of-fact compassion of a woman who understood that the work was not about her feelings, but about the animal in front of her. She had watched Parker Raines deny 3 veteran applicants in the past 2 years for reasons that seemed to her to have more to do with the performance of authority than the welfare of animals, and she had said nothing because she had not known what saying something would accomplish. She watched Ranger break the latch and sit in the hallway facing the exit, and she understood, with a clarity that surprised her only in the sense that she'd stopped believing this kind of clarity still arrived, exactly what the dog was telling everyone in the building. She picked up her phone and called her nephew, who was a reporter at the Corbin Times-Tribune, and she told him to be at the county board meeting on Tuesday. Nathan drove back to his rental property on Cold Branch Road and sat in his truck for 20 minutes before he went inside. The right shoulder ached from the cold. The property was quiet in the way that rural Appalachian properties are quiet in October. The particular silence of bare trees and settled air, and a world that is moving more slowly than you are. He called his property owner, a man named Gerald, who he'd known for 2 weeks, but who had the immediate honesty of someone who had never developed the habit of saying anything he didn't mean. Gerald said the clause had been in the lease for 15 years, and no one had ever cared about it, and he would sign anything Nathan needed in front of a notary by Monday. He called a veterans advocacy organization in Frankfort, whose number the VA counselor had given him in August, and which he hadn't needed until now. He was on hold for 11 minutes and then spoke to a woman named Claudia Torres for 23 minutes. When he hung up, he had 3 things he hadn't had before: a federal legal framework, a timeline, and a specific name to call at the Kentucky Department of Agriculture, which had licensing authority over county animal shelters. He did not call Parker Raines. Raines would be at the county board meeting Tuesday. Nathan would be there too. He didn't go back to the shelter on Friday. He went back on Saturday at the facility's public visiting hours, and he sat in the outdoor exercise area that was open to visitors, and he waited, and after 12 minutes, the shelter technician brought Ranger out. Because visiting rules permitted supervised visits, and because the technician, a young man named Darnell, who had worked there for 3 years and who had never seen Ranger break a latch before in his life, had decided that whatever was happening between this man and this dog was something he was not going to interfere with. Ranger came through the gate and went directly to Nathan and pressed his head against Nathan's thigh and stood there. Nathan put his hand on the dog's neck. Neither of them moved for a while. He didn't know yet what was going to happen on Tuesday. He would know it in 4 days. Parker Raines had been planning to present to the county board at Tuesday's meeting, regardless of Nathan Cole. He had been working for months on a proposal to restructure the shelter's adoption priority system, which he believed was inefficient and susceptible to the kind of interpretive pressure that veteran advocacy organizations occasionally applied. He had prepared a 20-minute presentation with 3 charts and a handout. He had practiced it in his office. He was confident in it. He had done this kind of presentation before, and the board had generally deferred to him. Because he was the expert, and because the shelter was not a high-priority item on anyone's agenda, as long as it ran quietly. The meeting room at the Whitley County Government Center held 46 chairs, and typically drew 12 to 15 people for regular sessions. On Tuesday evening, it held 51 people, which required 3 folding chairs from the hallway and someone standing near the door. Parker Raines arrived to find this and did not immediately understand what it meant. He set up his presentation and arranged his handouts and spoke to 2 board members about the charts. And then he looked out at the room and saw Nathan Cole sitting in the 4th row with a folder on his lap, and a man in a suit beside him who had the specific bearing of an attorney who was comfortable in county government rooms. And in the 2nd row he saw Agnes Dalton, who never attended board meetings, who was sitting with a young man beside her who had a press badge visible on his jacket. Raines presented his proposal. He did it competently, and with the full prepared confidence of someone who believed the situation was under his control. When he finished, the board chair opened the floor for public comment. Nathan Cole stood up. He was not wearing his uniform. He was wearing the canvas jacket and a pair of clean dark pants, and he stood the way he stood everywhere, with the settled, particular stillness of a man who had been in rooms where what happened mattered. He said his name and his rank and his branch and the number of deployments, not as a credential, but as context, in the same tone you would give any relevant fact. He said he had applied to adopt a retired military working dog from the county shelter and had been denied under a policy interpretation that, he had been advised by counsel, was inconsistent with the Federal Military Working Dog Adoption Act of 2000 and its subsequent amendments. He said the Kentucky Department of Agriculture had been notified of the denial and had opened a review of the shelter's compliance with state licensing requirements. He said all of this in approximately 4 minutes, without raising his voice and without looking at Parker Raines. Then he sat down. Parker Raines looked at the board. The board looked at the attorney beside Nathan. The attorney opened his folder. What happened in the next 20 minutes was not a confrontation in the way that word usually implies. It was quieter than that. Raines had his charts and his handouts and his 9 years of institutional authority, and Nathan Cole had a federal statute and a Kentucky licensing review and a veterans advocacy attorney and a reporter from the Corbin Times-Tribune, and none of those things required anyone to raise a voice. Raines did raise his voice once, not in anger exactly, but in the particular stridency of a man who is realizing that the ground he thought was solid has been shifting for some time without his knowledge. The board chair asked him to lower it. Agnes Dalton spoke for 3 minutes. She was not a dramatic woman, and she spoke in the straightforward way of someone who has simply decided to tell the truth, which is its own kind of dramatic when the truth has been waiting 11 years to be told. She described 3 denials she had witnessed. She described the specific language Raines had used in each case. She described the dog who had been waiting for 8 months, and the man who had come back for him 3 days in a row, and the latch that had not held on Thursday morning. Nobody spoke for a moment after she sat down. The board voted 6-0 to table Parker Raines' proposal pending the outcome of the state licensing review. Ranger came home the following Monday. Gerald had the notarized waiver ready by Friday morning. Claudia Torres, at the Veterans Advocacy Organization, had filed the necessary documentation with the state. The Kentucky Department of Agriculture completed its review of the Whitley County Shelter's veteran adoption policies and issued a corrective compliance order that required the shelter to revise its application procedures within 60 days. Parker Raines hired an attorney to respond to the compliance order. By December, he had accepted a negotiated resolution that included a formal revision of the shelter's adoption policy, the implementation of an MWD-specific adoption fast-track, and, in a conclusion that neither Raines nor Nathan Cole had anticipated, a partnership with a veterans services organization in Corbin that had been looking for exactly this kind of connection for 2 years. Raines retained his position. He had not broken the law, only the spirit of it, and county government tends to make those distinctions carefully. He did not speak to Nathan again. Nathan did not require him to. 4 months later, on a cold February morning, Senior Chief Nathan Cole sat on the porch of his rental on Cold Branch Road with his coffee going warm in both hands and Ranger asleep across his feet. The right shoulder ached the way it always ached in February. The mountains were where they always were, old and permanent outside the railing. Ranger's chest rose and fell in the steady, unconcerned rhythm of a dog who has decided, at last, that wherever he is where he is supposed to be. His tail, which had been still for 8 months in a shelter kennel, moved once in his sleep, the slow, certain arc of an animal at peace. Inside the shelter, the new MWD Adoption Fast Track program had placed 4 dogs with veterans in its first 2 months. Darnell, the technician, had become its informal coordinator because he had a gift for it and because Agnes Dalton had told the board chair so at the December meeting, loudly enough to be sure it was on record. Agnes herself still came every Tuesday and Thursday. She had started bringing her nephew on Saturdays, which was not strictly necessary, but which she considered worthwhile. Sometimes God doesn't arrive with a trumpet. Sometimes he sends a 5-year-old German shepherd who has been patient for 8 months and who has finally had enough of being patient, and who breaks a latched steel door, not in desperation, but in the complete and certain knowledge that the person on the other side of it is worth breaking it for. We talk about loyalty as though it is something we teach, something we train into animals and model for children and practice until it becomes habit. But there is a kind that cannot be trained. There is a kind that simply arrives between a particular man and a particular dog, and it does not require an application or a waiver or a 5 to 7 business day processing window. It simply is. And when it is genuine, when it is the real thing, no latch in the world holds it. God does not always remove the obstacle. Sometimes he sends something 4-legged and 79 pounds through the obstacle instead, so that the man on the other side knows, beyond any doubt, that he is worth reaching. If Nathan's story moved you, if it reminded you that the right things do find each other, even through steel doors and county policies and 9 years of someone's small authority, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Have you ever seen a rule enforced in a way that had nothing to do with justice? We'd like to hear that. And if you believe in the kind of loyalty that doesn't wait for permission, please subscribe to the channel. We will keep telling these stories because the world needs them. May God bless you, protect your family, and remind you that the ones who are worth reaching will always find a way to reach back.